this is something that the MSP community chats about amongst themselves, whether it's, in forums, Reddit or Spiceworks, things like that. You'll see this kind of dialogue going on. How do I raise my prices? Should I raise my prices? If I do, how do I do it? So I think this is a cornerstone discussion for MSPs to understand how to price, how to raise prices accordingly, how to do it the right way. The value-based approach, I think, is key. Communication is key. But yeah, this is in terms of the subject matter itself. This is right on, and I think especially Kevin going forward, it's going to be even more crucial as the technology is sure to change now on a every 6 months, yearly basis. So how can you expect to change or charge the same as you did the year before when your own technology stack is potentially going to be very fluid?
Yeah, and the other thing that I was thinking about, and really didn't include it in the piece, but I've been thinking about it after writing it, is the other challenge is a lot of businesses are trying to cut expenses right now, and you're in a process of trying to raise prices. And so you're completely at odds with, kind of your intention on both sides. So one would think it's not a good time to update your stack. You know what I mean? Because you take on these new things. But I would kind of say that it's the opposite, and that really these services are needed more than ever. And so there needs to be some kind of give and take in this process.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. The stack I think is going to change. It brings up another point too, Kevin, about how to structure the contract in terms of yearly pricing. Some MSPs, will go for 3 years at the beginning, and I think that there could be a dichotomy there. It's important to look at, would you actually want to wait 3 years before you potentially have the chance to sit down and talk about that contract? Then it's going to be probably a rather large increase. And it seems to be the preference in the marketplace to do incremental, smaller increases. Certainly not wait 36 months. And I can't imagine an internal stack would look much the same. And at least 20-25% of that stack's probably going to, like we said, be fluid and change around anyway. So I'd be interested, to know how you would go about this challenge as it is. It's a challenge on a yearly basis. How would you go about it if you're selling 3-year contracts up front?
When I was at MSP, our goal was always like long contract, long contract. Now thinking back on it, I realized that was kind of part of our problem, because you need flexibility. These relationships are long relationships. They're not necessarily short as it is. And so contract to contract renewals, if you were to look at that on, what the average rate is of basically reinstating a contract and renewing it, it's probably pretty high. And so you shouldn't be worried about losing a customer, trying to, basically sign them for years. I think it's more, you should really focus on execution, think about it more short term and say like, okay, I'm going to just do a great job 1 year, and I'm going to leave myself with options so that once that year's up, now I have all these different things I can do with service levels and things like that. And so I was curious, thinking about this with Viper, when you bring on a new MSP partner and they're going to go sell these services to their existing customers, do you find that it's kind of like a trickle, or as far as how many of their customers start to adopt the Viper suite, or is it sort of all at once?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, oftentimes the MSPs will have to factor in the changeover if they're going to do changeover, like their endpoint in their stack, which is a pretty critical component. So, oftentimes it the changeover happens in chunks. And so one example would be Viper as a vendor would work with MSPs to have a longer proof of concept so they can have that transition period where they're not being double billed right on a monthly basis for having the redundancy or two endpoints installed while they're in the process of switching over. So I think most MSPs come on a little, maybe not a trickle, but in chunks is what I've seen on the endpoint side. I'd be interested to know if there's MSPs out there that don't have this, kind of 2 to 5% yearly clause that can be exercised, right? I think that should probably be the norm. Otherwise, you're just taking a hit on inflation, and it should cover more than inflation. If inflation is 1.9 or 2%, you're going to raise it 5%. Well, you're not just trying to break even against inflation. The cost of being an MSP raises every year. I think the average business owner expects that, and they get that price increase as well from their other providers in their business. But so beyond that increase, the only other thing that I would find it interesting to discuss would be the communication aspect. And if QBRs are something that's in the regimen of most MSPs, the notion that you had of benchmarking with best practices compared to the minimum standards that we as the provider are willing to take on before the notion of purging that client or allowing it to churn. So just interested to know if you had QBRs and if you think that that kind of open communication where you can present the threat data, show this client everything you've done, everything you've stopped, and have that 4 times a year, shouldn't it be a lot easier then to go ahead and try to have that conversation at renewal to increase the price?
So as far as our MSP was concerned, we didn't do like the cost of living increases and things like that where we should have. That is something that got baked into the contract later on. But what we did start to develop kind of in the last like year and a half of the business, what we called like a tech success plan. And so, typically an MSP would have multiple bundles, and the business would be able to choose which bundle they wanted, right? And so maybe you have it like from bronze through platinum.
Good, better, best, right?
Yeah, right. And so what we did is we actually documented our best practices into tiers. And then instead of letting them choose, we basically told them what pricing model they fit into based on how well they adhered to best practices. What was cool about this is it created an instant roadmap and an instant incentive for them to take on projects, or basically take on new products and services that would check off these boxes. Because once they did, they were able to decrease their rates. And so those were things like rates like on a per user basis or rates on like project labor, things like that. And so, for example, if their rate was $175 an hour for project labor, and then they were able to complete 2 projects and that we had on the roadmap, then now that would get dropped down, let's say $10 an hour, to 165. And then that would go. And then obviously they would get other discounts on other services as well. So the goal was sort of in the last year to start. And so we started doing, I wouldn't call them QBRs because we were doing them on almost a more frequent, it was like a constant conversation, trying to get them in front of this and explain to them where they've stood, and what we wanted to do going forward. Now, the hardest part of that process was that some people were already getting a really good deal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it was hard to swallow like discounting them beyond that because we wanted to go the opposite direction. But what we immediately saw was people were more willing to increase their service levels and take on new projects, which is ultimately the goal.
Yeah, that's interesting. The polarity that exists between, let's say, a customer that's been with you for 5 years, that on that 5th year, if you're doing annual potential increases, they might be thinking the opposite. Well, geez, I've been with you for 5 years. Where's my loyalty program? You're talking about raising the price, and I was actually coming to the table thinking about a discount. So the schema that you mentioned, where you're able to maybe reflect or kind of show that discount, how you outlined, could help to offset that.
Yeah, and the other thing that, this isn't something that we did, but it's something I've thought of recently was offsetting, basically having like a mandatory referral on an annual basis where you're getting an increase unless you give a referral, something like that,
Oh, that's
where
nice. Yeah, I like
it's
that.
just a way for
Yeah.
them to weasel out of, giving you or getting an increase basically.
So if you're ever going to fire a client as an MSP and kind of, succumb to that bottom churn that's bound to happen, if not, why would you fire somebody if not for kind of not being willing to move along with the technology on a yearly basis? What other than non-payment, why else would you fire a client?
So there are sometimes it's just expectations. Sometimes it's that, and really this actually happens more so with older clients that have been around a long time, is that they just have like a skewed expectations of what you provide. Maybe they didn't get charged properly early on, where like somebody was like, "Oh, that was our fault. We're not going to charge you this time," and then now suddenly that thing becomes free every single time. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
you get to a point where sometimes it's just not a good fit either from like a relationship standpoint, communication standpoint. We actually did. We have a system we called the 5 R's. It's a way to grade your customers on each individual part of the relationship. Do they pay on time? Are they nice to you and your employees, which is huge? We had a couple clients that we had to unfortunately get rid of because they just did not treat our help desk very well,
They just
and
rip their head
so
off type of thing.
yeah, but they were great clients. They would refer us business all the time. They were on auto pay, and so like that's why you have to factor all of these things into it. Is that there's never just one. It's this balance between all these different things, and they're all equally important. And so you would be kind of like doing a disservice to your own team if someone was really great financial customer, meaning they pay on time, they're high margin, and they refer you business, but they don't treat your team well. And so like that, you have to go into those and uh, be able to navigate all those different relationships.